On the morning of the 11th of March, 1924, a 21-year-old walked away from a farm outside Strasburg, North Dakota, roughly 60 miles south of Bismarck, on land that had only recently been carved out of open prairie. He was carrying an accordion he'd spent the last 4 years earning, not with cash, but with labor, under a contract he'd personally negotiated with his own father at age 17. He had $3 pinned inside his jacket. He had a 4th grade education, and his English was barely functional, because until that point in his life, he'd spoken almost none of it. Here's what that young man was walking toward: 31 years on American television, from 1951 to 1982. 16 of those years on a national network in prime time, and 11 more after that on a distribution system he built with his own hands, reaching a reported audience of up to 30 million viewers every single week. The longest-running musical variety program in the history of the medium, still airing on public television stations more than 100 years after his birth. His name was Lawrence Welk. For 3 decades, tens of millions of Americans tuned in every week and understood almost nothing about who they were actually watching. They knew the bubble machine, the matching outfits, the champagne music. They knew the smiling man in the dinner jacket, counting his band in with an accent half the country could do a dead-on impression of, and the other half found slightly absurd. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, he was the single easiest punchline on television. Critics used his name as shorthand for everything square and out of touch. Comedians mimicked him endlessly. Younger audiences rolled their eyes when their parents switched him on, and practically none of them grasped what they were actually seeing. But here's the thing: that accent everyone mocked wasn't a bit. The story behind it is stranger than anyone thought to ask about. The farm boy, who signed a 4-year labor contract with his own father at 17, kept every last day of it. The so-called musical family wasn't just a warm on-screen image. It was a real financial structure, and it's a big part of why audiences stayed loyal for 30 years straight. And the man the entertainment industry dismissed as a harmless throwback did something in 1971 that no network executive saw coming, and that very few people in the history of show business have pulled off at all. If you want to understand who Lawrence Welk actually was, stick around. Lawrence Welk came into the world on the 11th of March 1903, inside a farmhouse on the outskirts of Strawburg, Emmons County, North Dakota. The walls were wooden frames packed with sod, because on that stretch of open prairie, timber was scarce and money was scarcer. If your Saturday nights as a kid ever revolved around that bubble machine, drop a like, because someone else out there remembers it too. His parents were Ludwig and Christina Welk, Roman Catholic, ethnically German, and immigrants who had crossed into America in the early 1890s. They hadn't come from Germany directly. They came from the Kurgan district near Odessa, in what was then the Russian Empire and is now Ukraine. Their own ancestors had migrated eastward out of Alsace, generations before that, a chapter of history most Americans have never encountered, and one that shapes nearly everything about this story. They arrived with almost nothing and homesteaded what they had. The family account, repeated many times over the years, says their first winter on American soil was spent huddled beneath an overturned wagon covered with packed earth. Stop and sit with that for a moment. A family crossed an ocean, and then most of a continent, landed on flat, open prairie, with no shelter and no wood to build any, flipped their wagon upside down, pressed sod over it, and lived inside that until the season changed. Lawrence was the 6th of 8 children born into that life. Emmons County in 1903 wasn't romantic frontier country. It was grinding agricultural land with punishing winters, worked by immigrant families who had been handed plots of earth on the simple condition that they endure. Ludwig farmed and also worked as a blacksmith, and every child in that house was put to work the moment they were old enough to be useful. Here's something almost no one sitting in front of their television set in 1965 would have guessed. That household didn't speak English. German was the language of the family, the farm, and the wider community surrounding it. Strawburg was a German-speaking settlement, The church held services in German. The parochial school Lawrence attended was staffed by German-speaking nuns, and he left that school after the 4th grade. 4th grade. Hold that number against what this man eventually built. He went on to run a national television production, negotiate directly with a major network, manage a payroll covering dozens of performers, and design a profit-sharing arrangement for his entire cast. His formal education ended at roughly 9 years old. Part of that was simply the arithmetic of survival, because a homestead with 8 children needs working hands far more than it needs students. And then, around age 10, something happened that nearly ended the story altogether. Lawrence Welk's appendix ruptured, there in Emmons County, around the year 1913. That rupture came close to killing him, and getting him to Bismarck, 60-odd miles away, was the only thing that saved his life. The recovery stretched on for months, slow and confining, and during all that time he had an instrument in his hands. 2 facts shaped everything that came after, and they arrived together in the same stretch of childhood. He lost his formal schooling, and in those long empty months of getting well, he found the music. There's a version of that boy who heals completely, goes back to school, and ends up farming in Emmons County, like his brothers. That version almost existed, right up until the appendix ruptured and German stayed the household language. He would tell interviewers throughout his career that he didn't begin learning English until he was around 21 years old. Sit with that for a moment, against everything you think you know about the man. For 31 years, American television audiences heard that accent and decided it was a character, a put-on, some folksy routine a country entertainer wore for the cameras. Critics dissected the mispronunciations and the fumbled introductions as though they were part of a carefully rehearsed act. They weren't. They were a man performing live in front of tens of millions of people every week in his second language, one he hadn't started learning until adulthood, with a 4th grade education as his only foundation. Try running that experiment yourself. Take any performer you admire, place them in front of 30 million viewers, and ask them to host live, introduce guests by name, banter with a studio audience, read cue cards, and ad-lib, all in a language they first encountered at 21, with almost no formal schooling behind them. Almost no one could do it. He did it for 31 years. The single most mocked thing about Lawrence Welk turned out to be the one thing none of the people doing the mocking had any right to laugh at. The music itself came from his father. Ludwig Welk had carried an accordion out of the old country, and that choice tells you something about what a family holds on to when it can take almost nothing. That instrument crossed an ocean and then crossed a continent by ox cart, arriving eventually at a sod house on the North Dakota plains. In the evenings, the father played it, and the son couldn't take his eyes off it. Lawrence scraped together whatever pennies he could find and ordered himself a cheap mail-order accordion. He played it until it literally fell apart. By his early teens, he was picking up money at barn dances and weddings and whatever else the county had to offer, starting around the age of 13. But a mail-order instrument has its limits for a player who's genuinely serious about the craft. By 17, he wanted a professional one, and a professional accordion cost $400. On a Dakota homestead in 1920, that was an enormous sum of money. The Welk family didn't have money to spare, and they certainly weren't going to hand a teenager $400 for something as impractical as a music career. As far as Ludwig and Christina were concerned, playing instruments wasn't a profession, so Lawrence came to them with a proposition. He would work the family farm until his 21st birthday if his father fronted the $400, and every cent he made playing dances during those 4 years would go straight into the family's pocket, not his own. They took the deal. It's worth slowing down and looking at what each side actually agreed to. Ludwig and Christina were spending money they couldn't afford on an instrument they didn't believe in for a purpose they thought was foolish. What they got back was 4 years of guaranteed labor from their most capable son, plus whatever income he could bring in on the side. From a purely practical standpoint, that wasn't a bad arrangement. Lawrence, on the other hand, was signing away his late adolescence for one object and one chance. Now, plenty of young people have struck that kind of bargain with a parent, and most of those deals collapse somewhere around year 2. Because teenagers who want to be musicians aren't exactly known for following through. Lawrence Welk followed through completely. He worked the farm, he played the dances, he handed the money over. He didn't renegotiate, didn't leave a day early, and by every surviving account, he didn't complain once. On the 11th of March 1924, the day he turned 21, the agreement expired, and he walked off that property. He had the accordion he'd worked years to own, $3 pinned inside a new jacket, a 4th-grade education, and no real command of English. He had no contacts, no plan, nothing except the decision to go somewhere else. And by all accounts, his family believed he was heading straight toward failure. That's the second thing his audience never knew, and it completely reframes how you see him. The man America wrote off as a wholesome simpleton had, at 17, identified exactly what he wanted, calculated what it would take to get there, negotiated the terms himself, and then spent 4 years delivering on every single condition to the letter. There's very little in the entire history of American show business that comes close to that level of discipline. And notice what that says about how his mind actually worked. He didn't run, which is the version of the story most people would expect. He didn't borrow the money from someone else, didn't beg for it, didn't sulk over the answer he was given. He sat down and figured out how to make it work within the constraints he was given, and then he did exactly what he said he would. That kind of thinking doesn't come from growing up on a farm. It comes from someone who already understood negotiation at a deep level, working out what the other person needed, offering something they couldn't reasonably turn down, and then following through without a single exception. Welk was doing that at 17, in his second language, with 4 years of formal schooling behind him. Most people build that skill over decades. He arrived with it. What came next was 13 years of the hardest working education the entertainment business could hand a person, and almost none of it happened in public. He played wherever someone would hire him, and in the early days, that meant barn dances, weddings, and small-town gathering halls. He wasn't an artist with a career yet. He was a laborer who happened to carry an accordion. In 1926, he landed with a small traveling outfit called the Peerless Entertainers, led by a man named George T. Kelly. Welk spent the rest of his life giving Kelly credit for teaching him how the business actually worked, not the music. He already had that. What Kelly gave him was the other education: booking, advertising, showmanship, how to read a crowd, and how to handle everyone a traveling show puts in your path, from theater managers to hostile drunks. For a young man with rough English, no social polish, and no schooling past the 8th grade, that apprenticeship was worth more than any conservatory in America. Welk knew it, and he said so for 6 decades straight. When he started building his own groups, the names they cycled through give you a real feel for the era. The Lawrence Welk Novelty Orchestra, the biggest little band in America, the Hotsy Totsy Boys, and once a sponsorship arrived, the Honolulu Fruit Gum Orchestra, a name no bandleader has ever quite lived down. In 1927, the group headed south toward New Orleans to escape a North Dakota winter and ran out of momentum in Yankton, South Dakota. They auditioned at a local radio station called WNAX. The audition went out live, and it landed well enough that the station handed them a regular program. That slot ran well into the 1930s, and it changed the shape of everything that followed. Radio in the rural Midwest during that decade wasn't just one option among many. It was the only option. It was how a farm family in South Dakota learned anything about the world beyond their county line. A band with a steady WNAX slot could fill ballrooms across 4 states, and that's exactly what they did. They bought a tour bus, worked the Tom Archer ballroom circuit through Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Missouri, and read on-air commercials for hog tonic and agricultural supplies between sets. Through the worst years of the Depression, Lawrence Welk was what the business called a territory band leader. Running a small traveling business in the 1930s meant handling a payroll, booking your own dates, and driving between towns that were hollowing out. Welk was doing exactly that through the Dust Bowl years. In the precise part of America the Dust Bowl hit hardest, playing dance music for people who had almost nothing left to spend on a night out. It was in Yankton that he met Fern Renner, a nurse working at Sacred Heart Hospital. He courted her. They married in 1931, and he was 28 years old. That marriage held together for 61 years, right up until the night he died. They had 3 children: Shirley, born in 1932, Donna in 1937, and Lawrence Jr. in 1940. Hold on to that. When this story reaches its conclusion, those numbers are going to matter more than almost anything else we've covered. Fern wasn't simply a wife waiting at home. She had trained for a real profession at a time when nursing was one of the very few genuine careers available to a woman in South Dakota. She raised 3 children, largely on her own, built around a husband who was working across 4 states at once. By the late 1930s, Welk had shifted his base of operations to Omaha. The band had grown to 10 pieces, and he was pushing east, pushing up. Then in 1938, something happened in Pittsburgh that changed everything, and it didn't come from him, it came from the crowd. People started describing his band's sound as being like sipping champagne, light, bubbly, effervescent. He took that compliment and built an entire identity around it. From that point on, it was champagne music, and eventually there was a machine on the stage producing real bubbles. That decision tells you just as much about the man as the $400 contract does. He was competing square in the middle of the big band era, going up against orchestras led by some of the finest musicians in the country. He understood something most of them didn't. He was never going to outplay Ellington. He was never going to outswing Goodman. What he could do was be completely, unmistakably identifiable within 4 bars, be pleasant company for an evening, and never once make the audience feel like they were missing something over their heads. He landed the Trianon and Aragon ballrooms in Chicago, which in that era were among the most important rooms in the entire country, a very long way from a dance hall in Yankton. He recorded, he toured, and by 1950, he had spent 26 years as a working professional musician. By any fair standard, he was a successful bandleader. The catch was that the form he'd built his life around was quietly dying beneath his feet. The big band era was winding down. Ballrooms were closing across the country. That's the part worth sitting with. Television was spreading fast across the country, and it was quietly killing the big band era. There wasn't enough money anymore to keep 14 musicians on a tour bus, and the economy that had sustained those orchestras for 2 decades simply collapsed. Most of Welk's peers folded, took steady house gigs, or walked away from the business entirely. He was 47 years old, running a band in a dying industry, and had never gotten past the 4th grade. Then, in 1951, he packed up and moved to Los Angeles. On May 2nd of that year, his band played on KTLA, a local station, and something clicked. He was 48 years old, and he had just stumbled into the one thing he was genuinely made for. The local show caught on almost right away and ran for 4 solid years. In that stretch, Welk figured out television in a way that a lot of far more celebrated performers never really tried to. The medium was small, intimate, and relentless. It didn't reward virtuosity the way a packed concert hall did. What television rewarded was something different entirely, being the kind of person an audience was happy to invite into their living room week after week without ever getting bored of you. That's a rare skill, and it's a fundamentally different one from musical brilliance. Welk had it: consistent, warm, not a trace of edge, and a face that looked genuinely glad to see you. He also had 26 years of reading rooms behind him, a gift passed down from George T. Kelly, and a band he'd trained to be recognizable within 4 bars. Everything he'd absorbed since 1924 turned out to be preparation for a medium that didn't even exist when he started playing. On the 2nd of July, 1955, ABC put The Lawrence Welk Show on the national network. What followed over the next 16 years stands as one of the most durable runs in the history of American broadcasting. The show went out weekly into millions of homes across a country with only 3 networks and no way to catch something you'd missed. It was aggressively wholesome, and that was entirely by design. By the mid-1960s, that positioning had turned the show into something close to a national institution, particularly among older and more conservative viewers who were finding the rest of the culture harder and harder to recognize. Welk built his show around people, not material, and that single decision is probably the most underrated thing about the entire operation. Most variety programs of the era centered on a host and a rotating parade of guests. Viewers tuned in for whoever was booked that week. Welk did the opposite. He assembled a permanent company and let audiences watch them grow over years, which meant viewers weren't really following a show so much as following a group of people they felt they actually knew. Myron Florin, the accordionist who became his right-hand man, had joined in 1950, before the network years even started. His personal manager, Sam Lutz, came aboard in 1952. His musical director, George Cates, arrived in 1956. The Lennon sisters, 4 girls from a Catholic family in Venice, California, arrived in 1956 and became the first in a long line of young performers. The audience watched grow up on that stage over the next 21 years. Welk called them his musical family, and every critic in the country treated that phrase like a tagline. But there was something real underneath it, something that tells you more about the man than any review ever did. Lawrence Welk paid union scale. That was his policy from day one, and he never moved off it. On paper, that meant a skilled musician could almost certainly earn more by going somewhere else. Plenty of band leaders in that era paid above scale specifically to keep talent from walking out the door. What Welk did instead, starting in 1956, was build a profit-sharing arrangement tied directly to how long someone had been with the organization. Think about what that actually does. It turns a job into ownership. It rewards the one thing money can't simply purchase, which is someone choosing to stay. The longer you're there, the more costly it becomes to leave. Not because you're stuck, but because you've built a genuine stake in something you helped create. And then look at what that produced. Myron Florin joined in 1950 and was still there in 1982. Sam Lutz joined in 1952 and was still there in 1982. George Cates joined in 1956 and was still there in 1982. 3 men at the core of the operation, giving 30 years, 26 years, and 26 years of their careers to a single employer, in an industry where loyalty to anything is almost unheard of. The man with a 4th-grade education, whose entire public image rested on being unsophisticated, had quietly solved the hardest problem in show business. He designed a compensation structure that made people want to stay, and he did it in 1956, decades before that kind of thinking became common anywhere. That's what the audience was actually responding to, even if they couldn't explain why. When Welk called those people his musical family on the air, it didn't land like a slogan because it wasn't one. Viewers at home were watching a group of performers who had genuinely been together for 20 years and fully expected to be together for 20 more. That kind of history comes through a camera, whether anyone understands the reason or not. The critics never once wrote about any of that. They were too busy with the accent. And it's worth being straight about how brutal the mockery got, because Welk absorbed it for the better part of 3 decades. Through the 1960s especially, as the culture accelerated in a completely different direction, Lawrence Welk became the go-to punchline for everything square, safe, and outdated in American life. He was parodied constantly. His name needed no setup. Younger audiences used it as shorthand for whatever their grandparents were into. Critics who would never use that kind of language about a jazz musician used it about Lawrence Welk, and they used it constantly. He was fully aware of every word written. He wasn't sheltered from the criticism. and he wasn't naive about what it meant. And he never adjusted a single thing on the program because of it. No attempt to seem cooler, no format overhaul, no younger face brought in beside him, no rock song slipped into the lineup to signal that he was paying attention. He had an audience. He knew exactly who those people were, and he refused to be ashamed of them. There's a quiet kind of toughness in that kind of certainty. Then 1971 arrived, and ABC cut him loose. It wasn't really about him personally. What happened that year has its own name in television history: the Rural Purge. The networks studied their audience data, decided that older and rural viewers weren't the demographics advertisers wanted to reach, and swept them all off the schedule in one move. The Beverly Hillbillies was gone, Green Acres was gone, Petticoat Junction was gone. The Lawrence Welk Show went with them after 16 years on the network. He was 68 years old at that point. He'd been a working musician since 1924, which meant 47 years in the business, and 16 of those years had been on national television. Every reasonable read of the situation said this was the finish line. He'd tour a bit, accept the tributes, and retire somewhere warm, because a network cancellation in 1971 was about as close to a final verdict as the industry delivered. 3 networks existed in America at that time. If none of them wanted you, there was simply no other door to knock on. So Lawrence Welk built his own door. What he did next wasn't an obvious play with a proven track record behind it. First-run syndication of a high-cost weekly variety show, sold station by station across the country, wasn't how the business operated. The networks distributed programming. That was their function and their power, and nobody seriously worked around it. Working alongside his producer, he went directly to individual television stations with a proposition. He would deliver the show. The stations could air it, and in return, he'd keep a few minutes of national advertising inside each episode, which his own organization would go out and sell. That was the deal. In September 1971, just months after ABC had dropped him, the Lawrence Welk Show came back in syndication on more than 200 stations. That number deserves a second pass, because it's the entire point. More than 200 stations, which was actually more outlets than ABC itself had affiliates at the time. The network had canceled him for being out of date, and within months, he was broadcasting on more stations than the network that had shown him the door. And he didn't just survive out there, which is the usual fate of a canceled show clinging to a syndication deal. Reports from the syndicated run put his weekly audience as high as 30 million people, which was larger than the viewership he'd been pulling on the very network that let him go. The advertisers ABC couldn't sell him to turned out to be wrong in a spectacular way. Those viewers existed in massive numbers. They'd simply been miscategorized and dismissed. He kept making new programs for another 11 years, finally stepping back in 1982 at the age of 79. Think about what that actually means. A national network looked a 68-year-old man in the eye and told him his audience had no value. He spent the next decade showing them it ran 30 million people deep. He did it by pulling together a distribution system he built himself, one individual television station at a time. By that point, the Lawrence Welk Show had become the longest-running musical variety program in the entire history of American television. And roughly a third of that run came after a national network had decided he was done. That is the fourth thing the audience never knew. The man who looked like the least commercially savvy person in the room, the accordion player with the thick accent and the bubble machine, had quietly constructed his own distribution network after being canceled, and then used it to beat the very people who let him go. Nobody sitting down to watch that show on a Saturday night had the slightest idea they were watching one of the shrewdest operators the medium ever produced. He stopped producing new episodes in 1982, but the show didn't stop with him. Reruns kept running, and in 1987 public television stations picked them up for an entirely new generation of viewers. They have never really stopped since. There are people who discovered Lawrence Welk in the 1990s, people who found him in the 2010s, and people finding him right now, decades after the last episode was ever recorded, settling in on a Saturday evening to watch a bubble machine and a band in matching jackets. That is a genuinely strange afterlife for a television program, and it's worth being specific about why it happened. Almost nothing produced for television in the 1960s survives in continuous broadcast. Variety shows especially tend to age badly because they're built around whoever happened to be famous that particular month. Welk's didn't age for the same reason critics mocked it at the time. It was never tied to any single moment. There was nothing topical in it, nothing fashionable, no guest stars whose celebrity had an expiration date. A program built deliberately out of nothing contemporary turned out to be the one thing from that era that never became a period piece. In his later years, he had other interests too. There was the resort community he developed at Escondido in Southern California, a place many of his viewers eventually found their way to. A family organization ran the various parts of what he'd built, and his children, and eventually his grandchildren, joined it. He kept appearing as well. He introduced the rebroadcasts. He showed up at cast reunions. He returned to North Dakota, and that state has called him its favorite son ever since. The homestead, outside Strasbourg where everything began, is preserved today as a historic site. That sod house is still standing out on the North Dakota prairie. You can visit it. You can stand in that room. And the one thing that never changed through any of it was the same thing that had been steady since Yankton in 1931, and that was Fern. By 1981, they'd been married 50 years, and neither of them seemed to think that was particularly worth mentioning. There's no record of anything going wrong. No separations, no public drama, nothing across 61 years that any gossip columnist could ever shape into a headline. For a man who appeared on national television every single week starting in 1955, surrounded by young performers for 27 years, in an industry that practically runs on scandal, that's a genuinely striking fact on its own. He had been battling the effects of pneumonia, and he never came back from it. Lawrence Welk died at roughly 7 o'clock on the evening of Sunday, the 17th of May, 1992, at his home in Santa Monica, California. He was 89 years old. Fern was beside him. They had been married 61 years. His son Larry was there. So was his daughter Shirley. He was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. The funeral was private, which is exactly what anyone who'd paid attention would have expected from him. He had been performing in one form or another from the barn dances of around 1916 all the way through to his retirement in 1982. That's roughly 66 years of continuous working life, built by a man who left school around age 9 in a country whose language he didn't speak until he was 21. He outlived the ballroom circuit. He outlived the big band era. He outlived the collapse of the variety format. And he outlived the network that canceled him. The show was still on the air when he died, and it's still on the air now. So here's the honest version of this story, and it isn't quite what the title of this video might have led you to expect. There were no scandals, not one. No arrests, no disgrace, no drinking stories, no messy divorce. Nothing across 66 working years and 31 years on national television that ever put Lawrence Welk in a newspaper for anything other than his actual work. He married one woman in 1931 and was still married to her the night he died in 1992. His musicians stayed 30 years. His producers stayed 30 years. The double life wasn't a vice, and it wasn't a secret identity. What it was this. America spent 3 decades watching a man it had already decided was simple, and he wasn't simple at all. He was a German-speaking farm boy from a sod house who taught himself English as an adult, then walked onto national television and spoke it in front of the entire country for 31 years, and let them laugh at how he said the words. He was a 17-year-old who wrote his own 4-year contract and honored every day of it. He figured out how to keep people loyal back in 1956, in an industry where loyalty barely exists, and he held on to his team for 3 full decades. He married a nurse from Yankton, South Dakota, in 1931, and that same woman was still by his side 61 years later, on the last night of his life. When a national network cut him loose in 1971 and called him a relic, he didn't argue. He built his own network instead, stitching together 200 television stations and running for another 11 years in front of an audience larger than the one they'd taken from him. None of that ever made it onto the screen. What you saw was the bubbles. Anyone who watched him carries the same image: a grinning man in a dinner jacket, arms raised, counting off the band. But think about what he was actually holding during all those nights in that Los Angeles studio, in front of 30 million people. It was the same instrument he'd bought for $400 in 1920, paid for by 4 years of farm labor from a boy who had nothing else to offer the world. He carried it off a homestead in Emmons County on the 11th of March, 1924. A 21-year-old with $3 pinned inside his jacket who couldn't yet ask for directions in English. He never set it down. He just kept playing, night after night, until the whole country stopped to listen. If this story moved you even a little, drop a comment below and let us know. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and stick around. See you in the next one.